Welcome to Chapter 3 of AP Psychology, Biological Basis of Behavior. So first we start with neuroanatomy. So the neuron is this whole entire thing. It's the neurocell and it's made up of all these different types of structures. So first we have the dendrites, which are all these ends, and they're the root-like parts of the cell that stretch out of the cell body, which is this part. And they receive information. And then we have the actual cell body, or soma, and this contains the nucleus and the other parts of just any normal cell. And then we have this really long connection called the axon, which is a wire-like structure that ends in your axon terminals or terminal buttons. And it is through here where you send signals. And the axon is covered by these little wrappings called myelin sheath. It's sort of like a cover on a wire. And these speed up neural impulses. And then we come back to the terminal buttons, which could also be called axon terminals or end buttons or synaptic knobs. They all have a lot of names. And they're the branched ends of the neurons that contain your neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that we use to send neural signals across neurons. And then between each terminal and your dendrite on another cell, you have this gap, which we call the synapse. And it is across this where we send our neurotransmitters. So this area on the dendrite that is receiving the neurotransmitter, it is called the receptor site because it is receiving. And then in each neuron, we have something called a threshold, which is the level of neurotransmitters, NTs, required to fire a neuron, which just means to make the neuron send a signal. There is a minimum level of neurotransmitters. And then when we are talking about releasing neurotransmitters, obviously it goes from the synapse to the receptor site, and it undergoes something called action potential. As you may know, in our brain, it's just a bunch of electric signal sending, so this electrical charge is spread down the length of the neuron, so along the axon, after the threshold is reached. And each neuron follows something called the all or none principle. That means a neuron, it doesn't fire halfway. It either completely fires or doesn't fire at all. And now we move on to the neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that are found in the terminal buttons, and they are used to send signals, so they are the means of communications between neurons. So there are two types of neurotransmitters. First, there is the excitatory neurotransmitter, which is a chemical that is released from the terminal buttons of a neuron that excite the next neuron into firing. And then there's the inhibitory neuron, which is released from the terminal buttons, and they inhibit the next neuron from firing. So if you want to think about it, excitatory makes the next neuron go, the inhibitory makes the next neuron stop. And then there is another classification for neurons, where we can either call them afferent neurons or efferent neurons. So afferent neuron takes information from the senses to the brain. So as you will learn later on, this takes information from your peripheral to your central nervous systems. While the efferent neuron does the opposite. It takes information from your brain to your body. So this is from central to peripheral. So these are the types of neurons. And now we move on to the types of neurotransmitters. First, we have acetylcholine, which is associated with motor movement. A lack of acetylcholine results in the famous disease of Alzheimer's. Then we have dopamine, which is similar to acetylcholine in that it is also associated with movement. It is motor movement and alertness. Lack of dopamine results in Parkinson's disease, and overabundance is related to schizophrenia. Next one is endorphins. Endorphins are associated with pain control. So when you take opioids, they are pretty much just artificial endorphins. And this is also what obviously leads to drug addiction. Next is serotonin, which is your mood control and memory. Lack of serotonin leads to clinical depression because your mood is not being properly controlled. Your next neurotransmitter is GABA, which is an important inhibitory neurotransmitter. As we learned above, this will stop your next neuron from firing. And the problems associated with GABA are seizures and sleep problems. Following that, we have glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, also involved in memory. Lack of this can result in migraines and seizures. Finally, we have norepinephrine, which helps with alertness and arousal, and lack of it can result in depression. Okay, so moving on to the nervous system. The nervous system is split into two, with the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is split into the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is a bundle of nerves that run through the center of the spine. So this refers to the nerves, not really the actual bone. And it transmits information throughout the body. And your brain is your brain, which we will go into. And then there's a peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. So pretty much all the nerves in your body that are not in your brain or spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system, it breaks down to sensory pathways, which is pretty much nerves that we use for our five senses. And then there's the motor pathways, which is involuntary and voluntary actions. So the voluntary actions come from the somatic nervous system, and the involuntary actions come from the autonomic nervous system. So somatics, when you want to go pick up a ball, autonomic is more along the lines of your heart rate, your muscle contractions, and that stuff. So autonomic is split into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is what speeds up your body. So, for example, when you're running, this is what speeds up your heart rate and gets your blood pumping, which is necessary. And also, when you're in danger, you might experience a fight or flight response. This is a sympathetic nervous system pumping adrenaline through your body to make it go faster and to either get you to fight or run away. However, as the sympathetic system speeds things up, there's also a system that needs to speed things down. Well, make things go slower. Makes body slow down. So, for example, after you have finished running, your parasympathetic system is going to kick in and make your heart go slower because your heart can't constantly beat at the level where the sympathetic system set it to. And then we have reflexes. So reflexes are actions that happen without your conscious control. Without conscious control. A way to test your reflexes is through the knee test. So when you hit the knee in a specific area, it will jerk without your control. So the reason for reflexes is that the stimulus is processed by the spine. Normally, it all first goes to the brain, then from the spine goes to the brain, then goes back through the spine, and etc. But this just gets processed through the spine. And we need reflexes because sometimes going through the brain is too slow. Now we look at research on the brain. As I already talked about Phineas Gage in chapter 2, I'm just going to summarize on that. So Gage was involved in an accident that damaged the front part of his brain, and doctors noticed that after the accident, Gage miraculously survived, and his behavior and personality had changed. Leading many to believe that it was the brain that has an actual impact on your behavior and personality. And additionally, there is some practices called lesioning, where it is the destruction or removal of certain parts of the brain. And by removing these parts and seeing how the person acts afterwards, we can see how that part may or may not have influenced them. An example would be frontal lobotomy, which was initially meant to treat seizures. And the idea is to remove frontal lobe. And now there are many ways of scanning the brain. First, there's EEG, which is the electroencephalogram. This is a procedure that detects brainwaves, as you can see here, detects brainwaves. And by analyzing these brainwaves, we can see what the brain acts like during the different stages of consciousness and use this information to generalize about brain function. And then there's the CAT, or the CT scan, which is a computerized axial tomography. It is a more sophisticated X-ray, and it uses several X-rays to rotate around the brain and combine all the pictures into a detailed three-dimensional pictures of the brain structure. This shows structure, not function though. And then there is the MRI, which is a magnetic resonance imaging, and it uses magnetic fields to measure the density and location of brain material. It doesn't use X-rays as a CT scan does, so the patient is not exposed to a lot of radiation, which could be cancerous. But both of these only give information on structure, not function. However, the next one, the PET scan, the position emission tomography scan, this measures the levels of certain chemicals that the brain is using, and as you can see from these colors, this shows brain activity. And then there's the fMRI, which is the functional MRI, and it combines MRI and PET scan. And it shows the details of the brain structure with information about blood flow in the brain, tying together brain structure plus cognitive tasks.
Okay, so moving on to the brain anatomy. So your brain is made out of three parts. You have your hindbrain, midbrain, and your forebrain. So first onto your hindbrain. There are three important parts of it that you need to know. Firstly is your medulla. Your medulla controls your blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing, and it's right above the spinal cord. So you can see it right here. And then moving up from that, you have your pons. Your pons is just above your medulla. It connects the hindbrain with the midbrain and forebrain, and it controls your facial features. Next, you have your cerebellum, which is this part. It's often known as the mini brain within the brain, since it looks like a smaller version of the brain. And it coordinates habitual movements. So moving on to midbrain, you have it controls simple movements with sensory information, and it's between your hindbrain and forebrain. You have what's called a reticular formation, which is a net-like connection of cells. And it controls general body arousal and focuses your attention. If this part malfunctions, you will be in a deep coma. So your forebrain controls what you think, and it's the biggest part of all of your brain. So you have firstly your thalamus, which is the top of your brainstem, and it receives sensory signals and sends it to appropriate areas. So think about the flight tower. It controls what everything else does, and it kind of just receives all the information and then transfers it to whichever part it needs to be. And then you have your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is right next to your thalamus, and it controls metabolic functions like body temperature, sexual arousal, and it's on top of the pituitary gland. That's why it has all of these functions, and it can tell you when you're hungry or thirsty, and it also controls your endocrine system. Amygdala and hippocampus, as you can see right here. So your amygdala is like your two arms for your thalamus, and it's at the end. It's the two arms of your hippocampus, so it's at the end of it. And amygdala controls your emotions, so that's really important, especially when we get to later chapters. And your hippocampus controls your memory. This is also really important as we move forward. And for your hippocampus, it's important for a memory because it's processed here and then it's sent to your cerebral cortex, which is permanently stored. So hippocampus is your short-term memory, cerebral cortex is your long-term memory. And then moving on to so building off of cerebral cortex, it's a thin layer of densely packed neurons. It's basically the wrinkled part that you see in a brain image. And it's wrinkled because it increases available surface area, so you can hold more neuron connections. Okay, so moving on to your hemisphere, you have left and right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere controls your motor functions of the right side of your body, and your right hemisphere controls the body movement of the left side of your body. And your left side is also controlling logic, language, and reasoning, and everything that's right here, anything that's analytical is your left brain, and then your right brain controls creativity, imagination. Anything that involves art, drama is your right brain. And since you notice that the left controls the right controls the left, it's something called contralateral control or bring lateralization. So you always control the opposite of where you are. So the areas of the cerebral cortex, we have 8 lobes, 4 on each hemisphere. So this is one hemisphere, and you have four lobes. You have frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe. So firstly, on to your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe is the lobe that's right behind your eyes. The anterior is called prefrontal cortex. And what it does is that it directs you through processes, for example, predicting consequences, pursuing goals, maintaining emotional control, abstract thought. So anything that involves personality or planning is in your frontal lobe. So just remember the 2 P's: personality, planning, frontal lobe. And in your left hemisphere, you have contains one or more special areas that is responsible for language processing. You have firstly your Broca's area, which is right here. This area is in the frontal lobe and is responsible for controlling muscles used for speech. Okay, so and then you have your motor cortex, which is right here. It is a thin vertical strip at the back of the frontal lobe, and it controls voluntary movements. And top of the body is controlled by the bottom of the cortex. So right here, it controls top of body, and right here, it controls bottom of your body. Okay, so moving on to your parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is responsible for any sort of perception, so it takes in any kind of stimulus. This makes sense because it has the sensory cortex within it. And then you can see that your sensory cortex is right here. So it's another thin vertical strip, and it receives touching sensations. And as previously stated, the top controls the bottom of body, and the bottom controls top of body. So the principles applies. Okay, moving on to the occipital lobe. It's at the very back of your brain, but notice that it interprets messages from your eyes. And it has the visual cortex, which allows your brain to process whatever you see. Impulses from retina and eyes are sent to the visual cortex, and your right retina goes to your right occipital, and your left retina goes to your left occipital. We'll go more in detail once we get to the next unit, which is on sensation. So next you have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe processes senses from ears. We know that senses from ears comes in forms of sound waves. So sound waves gets translated into neural impulses, which is interpreted in the auditory cortices. And then your sound of left ear is processed in both hemispheres. You also contain the second language area and your Wernicke's area, which interprets both written and spoken speech. So recognize that Broca interprets in Broca is what you use in order to speak, and then Wernicke's area is what you use in order to interpret someone else's speech. Okay, moving on to brain plasticity. We know that brain is flexible. So if one part of your brain is damaged, new dendrites will grow in order to fill up the space. And there's more plasticity within a child because dendrites grow quickly. Okay, moving on to the endocrine system. Endocrine system has glands that secrete hormones and is controlled by the hypothalamus. Firstly, you have the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland secretes adrenaline and prepares you for fight or flight. And then you have the ovary or testes, depending on your gender. So for a woman, you have estrogens, and for men, you have testosterone. Okay, so for genetics, the basic genetic concepts, you have 46 chromosomes, which is divided into 23 pairs. You have 2 recessive genes. That's where your trait is expressed. So for men, you have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, and then for women, it's X and X. And then there are 3 types of abnormalities. For example, the first one is the Turner syndrome. For Turner syndrome, you have single X chromosome. This will lead to shortness, webbed necks, and different sexual developments. You have the Klinefelter syndrome, which is an extra X. So it would be X, X, Y, and then this one will just be an X. And then lastly, for this syndrome, you'll lead to minimal sexual development and extreme introversion. For Down syndrome, you have an extra chromosome on the 21st pair. This leads to rounded face, shorter fingers and toes, slanted eyes, and eyes that are far apart. This also leads to what's called mental retardation. So this is everything that you need to know for biology. This is a big unit. Make sure you study it, and good luck in May.